Welcome to the Living in Savannah channel. I'm James Headley. In a recent episode, I shared some thoughts on the upcoming changes due to the National Association of Realtors settlement, focusing on what those changes might mean for home sellers. Today, I'm going to follow that video up with a look at how the settlement may impact buyers. Before jumping in, let me thank those of you who have taken a moment to subscribe, as well as those who continue to like and share this channel's content. I sincerely appreciate it and hope you will continue to do so. With that said, let's look at the impacts of the NAR settlement on home buyers. Number one, expect to sign a buyer representation agreement before seeing any homes. While these agreements have been around seemingly forever, their usage has been limited here locally by most agents, including myself. While I will now be asking you to sign one of these agreements early on in the process of our working together, I will continue to operate under the same guiding principle I always have, and that is, if I'm not providing you with value as your agent and/or we do not fit together professionally, I will happily release you from any contractual obligations. Secondly, one of the key aspects of these buyer representation agreements and a central element of the case settlement is the commission clause, or the handling of commissions. This is not the forum to argue whether the results of the settlement will be positive or negative for home buyers and sellers, and/or whether it will be an improvement over the old system where sellers generally paid a commission, albeit indirectly in some ways, to both the listing agent and the buyer's agent. While this was always optional and negotiable per our standard local listing agreements, it was far and away considered common practice. While I noted the very good reasons why sellers should strongly consider continuing to offer a cooperating commission to buyer's agents in my aforementioned recent episode looking at the NAR settlement from the seller's perspective, let's make the worst case assumption here that the seller of a home of interest to you as a buyer is not offering any such compensation to the buyer's agent. The buyer representation agreement that you will have signed before seeing any homes is going to include a commission agreement in it, specifying how much you will compensate your agent for representing you and securing your new home. Hopefully that all makes sense, but let's look at some examples to understand how this all would or might play out in the real world. To do so, I'm going to use the same number I used in the seller perspective vision of this episode, a home listed for $800,000. With that number in mind, let's look at a handful of scenarios that I think might help clarify the real-world implications and expectations we should have for a post-settlement real estate world. Number one, buyer A has signed a representation agreement with their agent, agreeing their agent will be compensated at 2.5%. Agent A contacts the seller to arrange a showing and inquires as to what the cooperating commission will be, if any, and the response is that it will be 2.5%. Let's assume the buyer thinks this is a fair price and agrees to pay the full asking price of $800,000. When this deal closes, things look pretty much the same way as they did in the quote-unquote old days. The seller pays a total of $40,000 commission, i.e. 5% of $800,000, and half goes to the listing broker and half to the buyer's broker. Buyer A pays nothing out of pocket, as the 2.5% they agreed to in their buyer representation agreement is covered by the cooperating commission. So move on to scenario two. Let's assume that everything stays the same except that the seller is offering no cooperating commission. Now the listing brokerage will receive $20,000 in commission from the seller, and the buyer brokerage will receive $20,000 or 2.5% from the buyer. In other words, the total commission on this transaction hasn't changed, but the seller is netting $20,000 more, while the buyer is paying $20,000 more than they would have in the pre-settlement world. And for scenario three, let's assume the seller is choosing to pay a total of 4% commission, split evenly between the listing and buyer brokerages. Again, using a full asking price sale, the seller is paying $32,000 in commission, with 16% to the listing agent and $16,000 to the buyer's agent. However, recall that the buyer's agent has contracted with our hypothetical buyer for a 2.5% commission rate. So the buyer is responsible for an additional 0.5% in commission, or $4,000, to their agent. So the total commission on this transaction is actually $36,000, with the buyer's side getting 20% of that and the listing side $16,000. Again, we could tweak the numbers all we want, but what are the odds of things playing out equally often between scenarios 1 to 3 as I've laid them out here? Now, frankly, I see scenario 2 happening the least often. Instead of buyers coming up with extra cash at the closing table to pay their agents directly, what is more likely is that buyers will make offers that are contingent upon the seller providing a closing concession equal to the cost of the buyer's agent commission if they weren't previously offering a cooperating commission up front. Or if the buyer is going to budget to pay their agent directly, they're going to factor that into the price they're willing to pay for the house. In other words, let's revisit scenario 2 for just a second to see how this might play out. So our buyer is budgeting $800,000 for the home, inclusive of any commissions they may have to pay. Since the seller is offering no cooperating commission in this example, our hypothetical buyer isn't going to offer the full asking price of $800,000, knowing that they have to pay their agent a 2.5% commission directly. This means the highest offer they're going to be willing to make is just under $780,500. As an aside, this results in our seller netting less than $1,000 more than they did in scenario 1 when they were paying both sides 2.5% each. Apologies for this being one of the longer videos on my channel, but I hope this helps to explain some of what is going on and illustrates what you need to be aware of as a home buyer. In my next video, I'm going to pick up from where these scenarios leave off and provide some words of caution / advice to help you avoid making short-sighted decisions that have the potential to cost you money when you are buying a new home in this new environment. In the meantime, I'd be most happy to speak with you one-to-one to discuss your specific home buying plans at your convenience. So please do reach out anytime. Until then, thanks again for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and I will see you soon in the next episode.